Inside, in the darkness that was not quite darkness, lit by the pale green of instrument lights and the fractured moonlight coming through the perspex, the crew felt everything. The vibration of the tow rope through the airframe, the particular shudder when turbulence caught the wings, the sense, profound and specific, that the thing keeping them alive was not an engine or armor plate, but a framework of wood and canvas, and the judgment of a pilot who had rehearsed this approach more times than he could count and was now performing it once, at night, over Normandy. And behind the pilot, taking up most of the space that remained, was the tank. It was not a large tank, that was rather the point. Everything about its presence inside the Hamilcar glider had been a negotiation between what was wanted and what the laws of physics and aircraft design were willing to permit. The armor was thinner than anyone would have preferred. The gun was lighter than the war had come to demand. The crew worked in a space that left almost nothing to spare. But it was a tank. And when the glider released, when the pilot began his approach to the darkened field below, when the ground came up faster than instincts suggested it should, and the aircraft ground looped through the Norman grass and came to rest with a violence that tested every weld and bolt, it was still a tank, still running. Still a machine capable of changing what was possible for the paratroopers and air-landing infantry who had come down into the same darkness. This was the Tetrarch, and its story is not the story of a great battlefield weapon. It is the story of an idea arriving before the world was ready for it, and proving, in the very act of arriving, that the idea was right. The Tetrarch is among the more obscure vehicles of the British armoured infantry in the Second World War. Too light for the main tank battles, too limited in number for strategic effect, overshadowed by events and by vehicles that came later and did more. It does not appear prominently in the histories of the decisive engagements. It does not have the kind of operational record that generates long chapters in campaign narratives. And yet it was present at one of the most consequential mornings of the entire war, the first hours of D-Day, when airborne forces were dropped and landed across the Normandy countryside before the seaborne assault began. And the question of what they could hold and how long they could hold it was not theoretical but immediate. To understand why the Tetrarch was there and what it represented, you have to start somewhere unexpected, not in France, but in the mind of a British military establishment trying to think ahead into a kind of war that did not yet exist. Airborne warfare in the late 1930s was, by almost any measure, still a concept in development. The Germans had demonstrated its possibilities in the Low Countries and Crete in the early years of the war. The British had watched, taken notes, and begun developing their own airborne capability from a starting point that was modest but determined. The core question that drove everything was, what does an airborne force actually need to do its job? The answer, on one level, was the same as any infantry force. It needed to take and hold ground, disrupt the enemy's ability to react, protect its own flanks, and survive long enough for ground forces to reach it. But an airborne force operated under constraints that conventional infantry did not. It arrived in small numbers, by air, with only what it could carry. It had no artillery train, no armoured support in the conventional sense, no logistics chain beyond what could be landed or dropped with it. It was, from the moment it touched down, operating on the edge of what was sustainable. The British Army began to think about what armour could contribute to this problem. Not tanks in the conventional sense, not the heavy, protected vehicles that anchored ground combat. The logistics of getting such a vehicle anywhere near an airborne drop zone were prohibitive, but a light tank, something small enough to fit inside an aircraft, or to be carried by a glider large enough to haul it. Something that could arrive with the airborne force, provide fire support, act as a mobile reconnaissance element, and present the defenders with a problem they had not expected to face. The Tetrarch was Vickers' answer to a version of this question, though its origins preceded the formal airborne requirement by some years. It had been developed as a light cavalry tank, intended for reconnaissance and exploitation, and its compactness had been a feature of that original purpose. When the airborne concept began to mature and the question of glider-delivered armour arose, the Tetrarch was already in existence, small enough, light enough, and available in a way that a purpose-built airborne tank would not have been for years. The Tetrarch's design reflected the constraints it had been built under, and those constraints shaped every aspect of what it could and could not do on the battlefield. The first and most fundamental was weight. Getting any tracked vehicle into a glider, and specifically into the Hamilcar, the large British cargo glider, designed partly with the Tetrarch in mind, required the vehicle to be as light as anything that could still function as a tank. This meant thinner armour than most contemporary tanks carried, a smaller turret, a lighter gun, and an overall profile that fit within the physical envelope of the glider's cargo hold. The practical consequence of light armour was that the Tetrarch could not fight head-on against the armoured vehicles it might encounter in 1944. The protection that would have deflected the lighter anti-tank rounds of 1,938 was less convincing against the weapons that 4 years of war had normalised. The crew of a Tetrarch operating in Normandy understood, with the clarity that experience provides, that their vehicle's survival depended not on absorbing hits, but on not being hit on using the terrain, the speed, the low profile, and the element of surprise to engage on terms they chose rather than terms the enemy imposed. The second design consideration was the gun. The Tetrarch carried a weapon that had been appropriate for its original cavalry reconnaissance role, and that retained some value against light vehicles and fortified positions. By 1944, it was not a weapon capable of reliably defeating the main armoured vehicles of the German army at standard combat ranges. The crew knew this. The doctrine that governed their use reflected it. The Tetrarch was not a tank hunter in the mode of vehicles designed for that purpose. It was a fire support asset, a reconnaissance tool, a mobile platform for suppressing infantry positions, and dealing with the lighter vehicles and improvised defences that airborne forces were most likely to encounter in their initial objectives. The third element was mobility. What the Tetrarch gave up in protection and firepower, it offered back in the characteristics that made it valuable to an airborne force. It was fast for its class. It was small enough to use narrow lanes and tracks that heavier vehicles could not follow, and it was capable of moving across country at a pace that kept it relevant to the tempo of airborne operations. A tank that could not keep up with the infantry it was supposed to support was, in the specific context of an airborne drop, more hindrance than help. The Tetrarch could keep up. The fourth consideration was the fragility that came with weight savings and the stresses of landing. Any mechanical system that has just arrived by glider subjected to the forces of a crash landing on unprepared ground, possibly in darkness, possibly on terrain that the pre-operation intelligence had not perfectly described, is a mechanical system that has been stressed in ways its designers could only partially anticipate. For a conventional tank, a minor mechanical issue might be resolved with time and tools. For a Tetrarch behind enemy lines, a minor mechanical issue could mean immobility in a situation where immobility was not survivable. The crews knew their vehicle's condition in a way that crews in conventional operations sometimes did not have to. Everything that kept the tank moving mattered, immediately and absolutely. The first hours of the Normandy operation demonstrated both what the Tetrarch could contribute and the narrow margins within which it had to operate. The air landing operations of the night of June 5th and the early morning of June 6th were not surgical in the way that planning always hoped they would be. Gliders came down across a landscape of fields, hedgerows, trees, and the obstacles that German defenders had placed specifically to complicate exactly this kind of landing. Some gliders landed close to their intended zones. Others came down in positions that were more difficult, more dangerous, or simply further from the objectives they were intended to support. The Tetrarchs that survived their landings intact, and not all did. The physical reality of a glider crash landing meant that some vehicles were damaged in ways that put them out of action before a shot was fired, faced the task of orienting themselves in the dark, making contact with the infantry units they were supposed to support, and beginning to operate in an environment where almost every feature of the ground was uncertain. This was the moment the concept was tested most directly, not against a specific enemy formation, not in a set-piece engagement, but in the basic operational question. Does having a tank here, in this situation, change what the airborne infantry can do? The evidence suggests the answer was yes, but conditionally.